Welcome to That Japanese Thing. Today we're talking about Genshiken, the manga anime series about otaku culture. My name is Chris. Welcome to my co-hosts, Dylan and Yesh. How are you guys today?
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Well, and yourself?
Good.
I am great. Today is one of my favorite anime of all time, Genshiken, the actual geek anime, the actual otaku anime, that sort of used to be about a niche culture in society, and specifically in Japan. It was sort of the kind of like geek Bible, I guess, of Japan, really, in a way that maybe Star Trek was similar in the West, or I don't really know what would be similar in a Western kind of setting. Maybe Community is kind of that sort of tone.
Yeah, I think that fits the role. Like there's nothing quite fits it. In terms of sort of bringing awareness to that sort of subculture. Big Bang Theory
Is
on
sort of the
the
opposite of Genshiken
I,
in my
I
mind.
was gonna say on the surface does it, but they make it Hollywood sexy, so it kind of fails in doing that specific job.
To describe Genshiken, it is a manga series that started, I think, in the late 90s, and it focuses on a geeky guy who has just entered university, and he's really shy, as all main protagonists tend to be, unless they're, an isekai, overpowered fantasy sort of person.
Hmm.
And he wants to join a geeky society, which just reminds me of my university life. And so he goes, and he's just too timid to approach like the booth at the entrance ceremony, where all the clubs are trying to recruit people for. And it just reminds me of actually doing that myself eventually when we were part of a geeky society at university. And from his perspective, the geeks at the booth are just too intimidating for him to join. And I think perhaps the kind of weird bravado that comes with being like just a weird person who knows you're a bit of a weirdo and in a weird club does make people a little bit uncomfortable approaching you sometimes when your booth is surrounded by anime and models and Warhammer posters and things like that. So
And people just sitting in it so comfortably.
I remember the one year we had really good recruiting, was when we hired a Pokemon character costume and offered like Pikachu hugs or something. I can't remember what it was. Was it Charmander? Something like that.
It was Charmander.
Charmander,
I actually
right?
remember this,
Yeah.
now that you mention it.
So trying to make your geekiness more accessible is difficult. So I do understand the feeling of the opening book of Genshiken. But in general, it's about these weird people in this club, in this little university club. And there are very few of them that actually attend this club. It's not a big club. There are, 7 members at max. And in the beginning, maybe 4. Each one occupies an archetype as is necessary in all Japanese fiction. Get your shy one, you got your weird one, you got your fat one, you got the guy that doesn't speak, you got the guy that likes cosplay, and the guy that likes, models and that sort of thing. And then we have a female otaku, who is basically a kind of character all by herself, who is a cosplay girl. And then we got another female otaku who is a BL kind of doshinji kind of writer, and that sort of describes the opening of Genshiken. The composition changes entirely in the second season, or in the second series, I should say.
Series, yeah.
Yeah.
It is quite a different series from the second one onwards.
But it's like this delightful kind of just kind of love fest of otaku culture and how weird it is, sometimes how disturbing it is. Specifically, I'm talking about Madarama when I talk about disturbingness, I suppose. With his weird opinions about literally everything, and I'm reminded of various of my friends in that way, and maybe a bit of myself sometimes. When you have a very strong and very certain opinion about something, and you're willing to kind of shout at someone about it, that is the most delightful part of geek culture, at least as far as I'm concerned. What are your guys' impressions about Genshiken?
First time I watched it, I will say that I enjoyed it thoroughly. I felt like snippets of it really were like insights into my life. So in a way, I feel like it's the perfect anime for someone who grew up a little too geeky in the 90s. Weirdly, I don't feel like it suits the mood anymore.
No, that, and as I was sort of alluding to earlier, it doesn't really exist in that way anymore, does it?
In
Geek
that
culture.
specific way anymore. Yeah.
I mean,
Between anime becoming so much more accepted and mainstream in the West, and then that pushing back on the Japanese lack of acceptance of otaku, and also some other stuff, we've really entered an era where there's still like an outcastness, but it's not so open, and you don't have to be so
so
defensive
yeah,
about everything.
I mean, in the 90s and 2000s, being like a geek had its sort of like there was like kind of a club which kind of accepted a kind of a wide range of people, and now anyone who kind of has watched Big Bang Theory can say they're part of geek culture. And so that sort of happened in Japan as well with the otaku culture. It's just very mainstream now, and there's the outcasts in society tend to be more disturbing people rather than people who are just kind of interested in comics and manga series. So being an outcast in today's society is a little bit weirder, more threatening, I suppose. You tend to still get used to have like war otaku, right? Gun otaku. And their thing was gunpla, Gundam models, and they knew a lot about tanks and weaponry and that sort of stuff. And they still exist as maybe a fringe group, but they're no longer really part of like the whole otaku geek culture thing, are they? They're kind of their own separate thing now. So it seems to me, anyway.
I feel like they were quite separate, quite a while back as well. It's a very specific thing.
I'm just saying, well, me and you have a friend who I won't mention his name, who is really interested in like military paraphernalia, and he was very comfortably part of our geek culture society thing now. I think maybe he would not fit into a modern term kind of geek culture catch-all kind of thing, that he would have to find like his own sort of niche group, which is unfortunate because I mean, you get as your groups get more and more niche, they often get more and more fanatical about certain aspects of the thing.
Yeah, that's true. That basically always brings sort of calming influence on things.
Indeed, yeah. And yeah, that's sort of a thing I miss. It's like a bit of discrimination I kind of wish would have continued. Because the people who existed in those groups were just weird, kind of enjoyable people to be around who had got used to the idea that they weren't really part of society. So a lot of things that normal people didn't really apply to them or us or me. and I miss that. I miss that bit of it.
You miss that home to go to.
I do. What are the activities that sort of define an otaku in your guys' mind? I'd start with Dylan.
For me, sort of any fanatical pursuit of IP, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a very generalized statement that I'm putting in, and I know a lot of people might limit that. But I come from sort of an in-between space where the guys before me were would have been defined maybe as otaku, at least loosely, if they were heavily into like Monty Python, right? Heavily into that Sid Worcester and Jeeves and
Okay.
Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie
Well,
style
yeah.
of
I mean, well, that's so there'd
comedy.
be a Western geek culture sort of thing,
Yeah,
right? So,
exactly. But I mean, I would challenge most folks in that if we're talking about Western otakuism, you can't exclude Western IP from that because you mentioned 40K right in the beginning.
yeah. I mean, I was just sort of talking about our old club.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, no, exactly. But
Yeah.
that is from our experiences, so that's the
And
way that I
and
would.
and definitely like Japanese otaku have Warhammer otaku.
Yeah,
I remember a guy who taught himself English by reading the Warhammer
yeah.
third ed rule book.
Everything must have been grim and dark for him.
I think he had a lot of inappropriate words for things.
Yeah.
Like you want to penetrate your AP was something he said a lot. I don't know why.
I think more so in Japanese otakuism, they tend to view things that may be considered childish pursuits as being more in line with otakuism. So gaming, for example, um, and I think whilst I'm saying this, it should be important that we're talking about like the 90s, early 2000s definitions of these
Yes,
things because
because it's
it
just not
does
true
change,
anymore, right?
like you said. Yeah, exactly.
Because I mean, you can be a fishing otaku now.
I
That's
mean,
just a thing people would say. Oh, he's a cooking otaku. He's a
that's
fishing
it. Yeah,
otaku. He likes
and
climbing mountains. He's
and
a
back
mountain
then, for
otaku.
example, making a living from gaming was not seen as common as it is today. So it was always a more, at least society would view it more as a childish undertaking.
Yeah, like a grow up, get a real job sort of thing.
100%.
Yeah.
Same with reading comics. Same with reading manga in more of a Japanese context. Watching anime. I mean, these are the types of things. But there was definitely a subculture around it because those cartoons, at least a lot of the ones that we were watching, are not designed for children. They're designed for adults,
Right.
right? Certainly, it would be very disturbing for very young folks to be watching that. And so it does go to show that there was a very strong underground contingent for people that wanted to consume that type of product and start fan bases about it that were very, very passionate. And I think it's just a thread that's common in pretty much every culture, really. You talk about people who are fans of Firefly, for example, in a more Western context, and they get very, very fanatical about it. I personally love Firefly, but you had whole petitions, brown coat petition and the
Yes,
like
yeah, I
carrying
remember.
on, and that is very similar to some of the displays of passion that you would see in Japan culture.
Before we move on to Yesh, I think being a otaku used to be about pinning yourself to an identity and then kind of, pushing that identity up against like the general population of society. And for me, I think it really started to be its own thing when the magazine New Type came out. New Type is a magazine about anime and anime related things, basically. And the word New Type comes from Gundam, right? That is basically what all the protagonists in Gundam are. They're like a kind of psychic kind of human. This sort of fringe human, new type as a new type of thing, and that's kind of what anime society was in the 80s. So from that point on, if you were the kind of person who would enjoy reading New Type, you would be relatively like certain that you had a place in that sort of otaku kind of community, I suppose. Anyway, Yesh, what do you think being otaku means?
I think being an otaku is prioritizing something definitely fictional over anything real.
Okay.
When you are at work, but you are on your phone looking up the release time of an episode of a TV show, when you are at home and you're chatting with the family, but in the back of your head you're going, God, I really need to get out of here. There's a new episode of XYZ up. There's
Right.
a release coming up in 3 months' time, and you're planning your route to get to the nearest shopping center to get it. That's an otaku.
There's
When
definitely
your passion exceeds, when your passion for the thing you're into exceeds your attention to your real life. This doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to your real life, by the way.
cool. Yeah.
That's maybe an imbalance of this. But I definitely think that passion defines an otaku. The topic of that passion obviously can change. Like you were saying, a fishing otaku is the thing now.
Right.
But yeah, I think when your passion for a thing outweighs your passion for anything in real life, that is when you switch into becoming an otaku.
So I just wanted to bring up this book I read in university called Otaku, Japan's Database Animals. I love the title, right? Database animal. It's just someone who browses, right? As in eats the leaves of a database around the internet. Not that the internet was necessarily a thing that existed when Otaku first
Very
came
big
around,
thing.
right? So this when was this written? This was written in 2013, but Otaku sort of emerged late 70s, I would say, as like a real thing that existed in culture. And so it's written by Hiroki Azuma, and he called them Japan's obsessive adult fans and collectors of manga and anime, known as otaku. And when he was writing about it, he called them an underground subculture. And today, very much of that doesn't really apply anymore. Because people who call themselves otaku might not be obsessed with anything. They might just be generally a fan of anime and might occasionally watch it. Especially in the West, people really want to call you a weeb or an otaku, even if you just watch Dragon Ball Z, right?
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous because basically everyone has seen that show.
Yep.
And to really qualify for the term otaku has become trivial, which is unfortunate because obviously you don't want people to kind of be stymied by the term or hindered by the term. And you see in a lot of older anime, when you call someone an otaku, they're really offended by it, right? And it used to happen as well in Western media. Calling someone a geek would have some negative social consequences for that person. But it just doesn't happen anymore. It's like, oh, you're an otaku. Oh, this is a real otaku's room you have here. Like, oh, okay. Does that bother you? Oh, not really. It's just kind of a normal thing that happens.
Well, the geeks have taken over to a certain extent. When the Avengers are the biggest selling movie of every season for the last 3 years, when the new Spider-Man coming out is a big deal, you've really taken over the culture at a point, you know?
I do enjoy that we can sort of sit here and argue about the death of geek culture as basically geek culture taking over a society. Oh God, you've won. How bad for you. But as people that may have lived through the embryonic stage of geek culture, it does feel like something has been lost to a certain degree.
I understand what you are saying, but I also get very angry at the people who are like, this is a bad thing.
Yeah, I don't want to be one of those people because obviously I love the fact that we have 40 new anime every 3 months, right?
And also, it just means that there's a wider support group of people who might be interested in your particular niche.
Yeah.
When I first joined Geekery, a lot of people were not into Gunpla, and I was big into Gunpla at one point. So I would go to the geek areas, but I wouldn't be able to talk to anyone there.
Yes, yeah.
And nowadays, there's a Gunpla part of the world. It's maybe not near me physically, but I can access them.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the internet has done quite a lot for that. Previously, if you were into something weird like stamps, you know. You would have had to subscribe to Stamps Weekly, right? Stamps Annual Edition, and gone to old
Guys,
Stamps
can I
Condition.
tell you
Yep.
about a part of internet history that is now so long ago? I don't know if there are people left who remember it.
And this is our official record to the world.
Lost in the depths of time.
There was a time where on image boards on the internet, before image boards were like known and accessible to most people, before Google existed, people would P2P share via IRC, or MIRC later on, ignore that for now, using codes from image boards to dedicate which channel you had to join in order to access the correct anime.
Yes.
So you had to be part of effectively a meme group in an image board to access a giant database of anime referenced only by numbers and no words or reference descriptors.
You probably also had to host some of it yourself on a computer.
Yeah, at the time, if you P2P shared, you had to have a seed ratio of 1.1.
Right.
Oh yes, I
It
remember the
was-
speed ratio that you needed to keep up.
Yes.
Back
that's-
in P2P, direct P2P days,
Oh,
I would maintain a 1.1. But this is how I accessed Evangelion once upon a time, and assorted other anime. They didn't come to me as Ava Episode 1. They came to me as 10298-1.
I just want to say to anyone who's listening that I'm sorry for having lost you guys. This is a weird conversation we're having. But if you want to know more about this era of the internet, just read Terry Pratchett's autobiography. And he talks about doing
more or
things
less.
like this, not in relation to Japanese culture, but although he did kind of like that stuff, but in relation to like sci-fi. He used to do similar things with sci-fi stuff and host his own computer servers so people could use them for peer-to-peer sharing and message boards and things like that. But back to Genshiken, I think, right? So
Right.
what is the first season of Genshiken? That is, to me, just what geek culture used to be. It was this small set of mostly men, generally, and a couple of hanger-on girls, right? So you'd have, like, the person's girlfriend was the one type. You'd have the fan of cosplay,
Yeah.
and then
She
you'd have...
she was properly accepted, I feel.
yeah.
Of course she was. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm just the type of early 90s kind of group, right?
Yeah.
Used to be maybe 60 to 70% men, and then there'd be like a few girls there. And there'd be genuine otaku girl, there'd be cosplay otaku girl, and then someone's girlfriend who didn't really want to be there, but was dragged there because, he wanted to talk about comics or something, right?
Yeah.
And
Or she wanted to just share something with her boyfriend.
Yeah. And on the men's side, you'd have, I think we just discussed, you'd have your anime manga otaku, you'd have your gunpla otaku, right? Which often went with like a military kind of style person who
You'd have your gun ota.
gun ota. Then you'd have your general ota who was just kind of interested in everything. Kind of reminds me of a like a Stephen Fry character. In that just a person who wanted to talk about any kind of particular thing. Star Trek, Futurama, anime, manga, anything that just want to have someone to talk about with that would be part of that circle. And they were a super useful individual because you could always just have them as part of any conversation, right? Then you got your real weirdos. That's your Madarame type, who is your normal obsessive, who has, as Yesh stated, his plan to go to Comifest, Comikit, as they say, or is the real name for it. Comifest was the one in the manga. And, he'll have the map of the thing, and he'll have his booths he needs to go to, and he'll have them prioritized in order so he gets the stuff he wants, right? And
Sure.
he's also the guy with the super weird opinions, the super fringe opinions about things, and he's he's the guy who's obsessed about these opinions and has thought of all the counter arguments in his head and knows which is right, which is wrong, and how to convince quote unquote people that he's right. Then you had your guy who wants to be a manga artist, wants to make anime, wants to do music, right? That'd be your creative kind of otaku.
The creative type, yeah.
And then there was just the person who wanted to consume like the media, be it games or whatever, right? I think that is the most general kind of otaku that has survived to this day. Like someone who's obsessed with the game franchise.
Yeah.
That's your Warhammer tabletop guy. Someone who's really into
Your
D&D.
Final Fantasy fanatic.
Final Fantasy. Someone who's really interested in like one specific anime. Your Evangelion kind of person who, or maybe like a One Piece person is, or like a Dragon Ball person is the kind of archetype there. That's that person who rewatches something again and again and tries to like unpeel layers and tries to find deeper meanings and things.
Yeah. Like very fixated in a very particular way.
Yes, yeah. And so, how do you guys rate Genshiken? My opinion is it's one of the better ones of all time.
For me, it's an 8 out of 10. I think it was a very crystallized, very accurate representation of its time. I think I've got a personal reason why I like it, because I was obviously alive in that time. But like character-wise, dialogue-wise, what actually happens in the show-wise, it's an interesting ride, but that's about it.
Yeah, I think that's a solid explanation of it, really, for me. I put it between a 7 and an 8 out of 10. What I do like feel is appropriate to say about it is that they very accurately captured certain things. Like you were describing the different characters and the different interests, but they do it so well where they, at least in the anime, they exhibit how people have their sort of niche fixations, but they also will dabble in other areas, but they'll certainly have some areas that are just overwhelming in terms of their interests and their passions. It's interesting that you mentioned the planning, the comic fest stuff. I've attended some of the big conventions, like one in the States, and there you try and plan and it all goes south. So the guys that can really pull off the planning definitely are on another level.
Yeah, Comic-Kit is more organized than like a Comic-Con though.
Yeah.
But you still get the guys who download the floor plans, download the schedule from the website, print them out, and then like cross-reference.
Right, yeah.
I've seen that happen at our own festival when it happened.
Which is sort of a ridiculous thing to do at our smaller ones, I think.
It's a bit wild for our smaller ones, but some people just feel like they won't get the full experience if they don't like maximize.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I don't want to discourage that. I just feels that when there aren't like necessarily like hour-long lines involved, it's an unnecessary preoccupation.
Yeah. It's like chalk and cheese. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, what you're saying in the anime, they really got it. I think in the manga, from the manga to the anime, they really toned down the obsessive nature of Madarame in particular.
Indeed, I did feel like he wasn't that weird.
No, definitely. He doesn't come across as that weird in the anime.
I think that's just because they couldn't put a few things that were like kind of weird imagery from the manga into the anime and then still show it on TV, right?
When I think back to that era, I keep thinking about 4chan and then anything like that just seems so normal.
Yeah, 2chan would be the original
The
4chan, right?
Japanese.
Yeah.
No, 4chan was first.
Was it first?
4chan was way first. 2chan evolved out of 4chan
Okay.
because the
Yeah.
Japanese kept getting racist against by the
Right.
4chaners.
Yeah, so like I don't even remember 2chan. I only remember 4chan back in the day,
That's the same
and
thing.
and the mild
really.
horror that I would have, and I'm like, oh, our geeky group is so normal.
So I was around on 4chan when 2chan got birthed, basically.
Yeah.
And that happened to a significant extent because 4chan freedom of expression board incarnate with anarchy allowed was extraordinarily racist towards everyone.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Japanese, Indians, Africans, everyone. So the 2chaners couldn't talk about anime too much.
If you want like the best thing that ever came out of 4chan or 2chan, it's Train Man, Densha Otako. Oh, why am I saying weird things strangely? Anyway, Train Man is like a thing that is just a series of posts from 2chan that have been translated into English, so you can buy the book called Train Man, and it's about 2chan anonymous users giving this man dating advice. And, you know, specifically in the beginning of the book, he says, well, we had to delete about 97% of the advice to put it in the book. But this is the general feeling of all the relatively good advice that I got from that. And it's a kind of a weirdly heartwarming tale that actually happened in real life. I recommend anyone just go and check out and read.
I can guarantee you most of that 97% involves chloroform.
Yes, there was a lot of that. But it was also the glorious days of ASCII art.
Yep.
That used to happen in text message boards. But anyway, Genshiken comes from that era.
Yeah.
Then Genshiken Nidaime, the second generation, is basically the transition to modern geek culture. And it's like the inverse of Genshiken, the first series, right? So it's primarily a female-orientated geeky group that has
The
taken
group we
over.
follow in particular
Yeah.
is largely girls. There's now a bit of a foreigner hype to anime,
Right, yes.
as we have an American girl that's come to Japan.
Well,
and
I mean,
is
that
quite
happened
otaku.
in the first series, right? But she joins the group in the second series, essentially, right?
Well, the fact that she's otaku-ish and like joins them is a focus in the second series.
Yeah. Sue. Mary Sue. So
Good
the first series manga drawing otaku girl takes over the club room, and so it sort of transitions into this kind of attempt at like a girls do cute things version of Genshiken. So that's what it seems it will be when it begins, but it continues to be kind of an amazing, just like
Otaku
real
culture.
otaku
explanation.
culture thing, just from like a female perspective, which I think might be better than the first series. I don't know if you guys feel that way.
I
But,
bounced off of two, hey?
yeah, really?
I'm not going to say it's bad. It's not a bad show. But for me, I enjoyed it way less. I saw what was happening in the show, and I recognized that it's real life-ish. But I didn't enjoy the characters or the club or the like events that were happening in any way. I basically disliked it.
Okay. I don't get that. I think I liked it even more than the first season.
Can
It was
can I point something out,
Sure.
which is that there is a generational change between Yesh
Perhaps.
and you. Actually, you know what I mean. Like
Yeah.
like same with our club room, because we've all had experience of that. I had three, well, and so did Yesh, had sort of three shifts of that club room. The initial phase of it, where it wasn't otaku-ish at all. It was like very almost punk, counterculture. It was handed off from the goths that started the club. and they were all into like Lord of the Rings and that kind of fantasy,
Right.
to more of a metalhead countercultural vibe, and then that got handed over to like more otaku-ish culture, and then that even transformed into like a more normalized thing where girls who weren't really part of the club would hang out in the club because it was, I don't know, interesting.
As soon as
Yeah.
we entered into that more normalized
Which
group,
I suppose that makes sense then, because I was sort of the head of the club at that point.
Yeah.
So
that
I guess
last
that's
point.
why I like
But
that part
interest
of
in
it.
maintaining the club went away, and like we just lost everything at that point.
Well, hold on, wait. Before we get into any of that, like what the point that I'm trying to make is, I find it interesting because it's almost like the series kind of accurately encapsulates the way these things change over time.
No,
See,
that's why I love it so much. It's
Yeah.
such a perfect.
I fully agree
metaphor.
that it encapsulates the transition, the forward progression. But that's kind of also part of why I bounced. Because the first one very accurately displayed my experience with otaku culture, and the second one very accurately displayed me bouncing off of it.
Right. I just want to point out that I think this club still exists in some form, and we've just all left it. It's not like it ceased to exist or anything.
Yeah, no, I certainly hope that it's still going because certainly the alternatives weren't. I feel weren't as interesting.
And just in general, like in real life, I think it was kind of important to some people just to have that space.
Oh, I
Fully
It kind of
definitely.
think
made
so.
them feel normal.
Not only that, but it's incredibly important for individuals who feel isolated by their personality, behavior, interests, passions, likes, and this goes quite deep. Whether it's your well, we'll get into that in a bit. I think it's quite important for them to have a space that they're able to connect with other people who may still be different, but are still respectful of them as being their own entity with agency, right? Like that's for me is critical. It's when you don't have those spaces where that's an acceptable interaction that it becomes, it's just harmful for your mental health. That's my personal opinion, but I believe very strongly that is accurate.
So, I mean, I just relate like a real life story from our experience. Not from our experience, from my experience. You people weren't there at that point. There was a girl who really, really liked anime. And her father would have beaten her if he had ever found out about that.
Yeah.
And like the clubroom at that point was just a refuge for her.
Yeah.
Because nowhere else in her life would she have had the opportunity to engage in a safe environment with that sort of culture. And that is the sort of feeling I get in Genshiken in general, right?
Yeah.
No one talks about their family very much in that show. I think for obvious reasons.
True.
They don't want to bring up the fact that they can't really relate to their relatives, and that they relate more to the other weirdos in the room than they do to people who theoretically are closer in their life.
But see,
Yeah.
I feel like season one deals with that isolationism and acceptance really well. And I didn't feel any of that isolationism in season two.
Yeah, and I don't really know if you watched it because that's a very big part of it, but just not from maybe like the general male perspective anymore. And
Perhaps.
this in part of the second generation thing is kind of also just moving on from
Yes,
that
moving
time
on
in
is
life,
big in it.
while the new generation kind of takes over. So it still exists in the second generation, but it's got a lot of different themes. And I think the main character of the second generation has a more modern kind of weirdness about them, like the cross-dresser guy.
Although
And,
he was handled very well, honestly.
Yeah, perfectly. I mean, and then that's what I'm saying. It's strange that you don't think there was any kind of societal pressure
Isolationism.
and that sort of isolationism against him.
like I would like to point out that this is an interesting thing about those groups, and I'm not I'm saying this as a general statement. I know that there's always exceptions, but I feel like when almost everyone coming there feels like they would have been ostracized for something that they view as being trivial, there's more acceptance for things that society maybe doesn't see quite as much as trivial, and that like speaks a lot to being accepting of people of different sexualities or gender expressions and that kind of like, right?
Yeah.
I always found our club room to be very, and I mean I might be wrong here, you know, I'm always open to people saying that they've had a different experience, but I always thought we were very open. Like we didn't care about that
I
side of
think I think the thing is with otaku and geeks is they always care about the detail that that person can bring to the conversation,
maybe.
not about the aesthetic, outside layer of that person.
In which case, I'm miles behind.
Right. Maybe you feel that way, but
Yeah.
from a certain perspective, it's much more important to the people in a close-knit geek community that the person understands weird, obscure references than the way they look or the way they interact with something.
Yeah.
And I
I
think
will
that
say I
is
think
why
that's
it
true.
was. Sorry.
I do think that that's quite true.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Hopefully, that
And I
is
think
that
that's
is what it is.
a beautiful thing about that community. That's that style of community. I really do. I think that's phenomenal. So,
It's also something that makes me a bit angry with people who want to take people out of it or call them kind of fake geeks or something.
yeah, I've always had an issue with that segregational sort of elitism that kind of pops up every now and then in that space.
Because I do understand it. There are definitely people who are just pretending to be geeks for some sort of, I don't know, purpose. But often those people will actually just transition into like a real kind of geek at some point.
Exactly.
And so why discourage them at the outset to not be part of your community?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely different takes on it. Like guys who are just starting, or people, sorry, who are just starting out in it, will generally speaking not, as you say, bring that level of detail to a conversation. Or they won't have as broad a depth of knowledge in that particular niche, but they'll get it eventually. I don't. You guys, do you define yourselves as an otaku?
Uh,
Would you say that you're an otaku?
no,
Yes.
I must be. I think definitely.
And yes.
Not
I would
specifically about
definitely
Japanese
say
stuff.
that
Though.
I am an otaku, in part because by the definition I gave earlier, that 100% fits me.
Yeah,
And see, I've known people who are like so deep into it that I would hesitate to call myself an otaku. I definitely call myself a geek. You know, I don't think that I am your standard sports loving, boozing, braaiing South African. In that regard, you know, it's very. I don't fit into that space. But I've also never really. I don't know about never being an operator.
dude, you're like a martial arts otaku. I hate to break it to you.
Probably, yeah. Well, about a very
And a gun
specific martial
ota.
art, though.
And a
Pretty
gun
much.
ota.
Yeah.
A
Well,
gun
more like
ota.
a
Yeah.
outdoors like oto maybe. I don't know.
Well, the gun
But
otas are also about the survival elements.
I
So
will. I will happily take on all those titles. I just don't want to pretend like you were saying. So this is the thing, you know. You have this fear because, well, I don't know about a fear, but I don't want to ever take someone's. What's the way I would phrase this is I wouldn't want to dilute someone else's identity by throwing myself in there when I see how passionate they are about something, right?
Yeah.
That's something I'm always maybe a little bit hesitant towards. But there's certainly no shame in it. You know, like Flip, you know, that club room was part of my history from the inception. You know, we've spoken about all the nostalgia of anime as a teenager, and you know, the same friends from high school carried on into university. You know, and just grew as a circle from that as well. We kind of all just sort of gravitated towards one another. It's actually really cool when you kind of visualize how this actually happens.
We got super lucky
and they come together, and it's just this awesome community that you can be a part of.
It's an organic effect that is only possible because of like the internet being a thing, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, the internet wasn't for us. It was mostly predominantly the university.
Well, you say that right, but I think a lot of people found each other because of people like Greg, who hosted anime events and would post about it online, right?
No, they definitely.
And during that high school period you're talking about, that's something he was doing.
Yes,
that's where I met him and some of you guys. And then I wouldn't have found the club were it not for people knowing about it from
that's true.
online community.
That's true. I think I know. Well, maybe I'm thinking of a different online specific.
And just sort of speaks to a more connective kind of society that was developing at that time.
Those bulletin board forums.
It wasn't so much an accident as something that was sort of inevitable, I suppose.
Yeah. Inevitable.
Indeed. But I think the moment I knew I was an otaku was when I started referencing television shows by their episode number and name. It's like, okay, there's no denying it at this point anymore.
You see, this is why I hesitate, because I couldn't do that. I don't have that. And even shows that I've watched and rewatched, I don't have that capability of holding that level of database accuracy.
Speaking of database accuracy, Chris, this is a little bit of a callback. I don't know if you will still remember. But do you remember when we were playing 3.5 in the club room? If someone asked a question regarding a rule, I would give them the book, the page number, and the reference.
It used to be something we were all capable of doing. Specifically Fuzzy, right?
Fuzzy was particularly good at it, but when Fuzzy couldn't remember, people would come to me. Because when it came down to page numbers, I was the one who remembered everything.
And I mean, it's like page 17 of the Dutch Master's Guide is where you'll find the table on and that's just something that used to be necessary and is not really anymore, thank God, because we have
Google resolves a lot of our issues nowadays. But on the topic of being an otaku by modern day standards, as the two of you know, I basically don't watch Western TV anymore. I only watch anime.
Right.
For the larger extent, with the exception of torturing myself.
I was about to mention the Trekkie.
Yeah, so me and Yesh have been torturing myself by watching Star Trek Picard. And
And this is funny because I watch Western TV, but I don't watch Star Trek Picard. Not that I've got anything against Star Trek. I grew up on TNG.
No,
you shouldn't watch it.
But I just love hearing you guys talk about it every week, about what's killing you in the latest episode. I'm sorry, it's great entertainment. Please continue.
But also, I basically don't watch Western TV outside of torturing myself. I don't read Western novels anymore. I only read... In fact, I'm famous for, while we are playing D&D, I will be reading manga.
That is the thing.
I mean, I used a scientific method to teach myself Japanese, Chinese characters and Japanese in general. So that is my otakuness coming through with language and such, I guess. Just my general desire to memorize things.
Where I'm staying up till 2 a.m. to watch live streams from my favorite Japanese streamer.
Oh dear.
And I'm not consuming Western culture things anymore. I'm only watching manga and anime. I think at a point I have to accept my otakuness is a little bit too determined.
Yep. No, it's gone too far. There's no going back. And on that note, I think that'll be it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. Thank you, Yesh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you
very much.
Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.